The diner was heavy with monotony. Light filtered through tired blinds, turning the air stale. Movements felt automatic, drained of meaning. In the midst of it, a sentence slipped out, spoken without resistance. Here, the ones who actually work never see the tips. They go to the manager's nephew. Walt Granger sat in the corner, faceless in the crowd, yet every syllable reached him. It was not rumor. It was confession, delivered like routine. Moments later, Darren Voss passed the counter. His hand closed around a stack of bills and buried them in his pocket. His stride carried no hesitation, no fear. It was theft presented as normal life. Around him, people continued to move. Eyes lowered hands, busy, no protest rising. The injustice stood naked in the room, and still silence reigned. If you want this truth to reach further, stay with the story, like it, share it, keep it alive. Walt Granger sat with the brim of his cap pulled low, every angle calculated to erase the man he once was. To the room, he looked ordinary, another traveler stopping for cheap coffee. But inside, the disguise rang cruel. He was Harlan West, the founder of Sunrise, the man whose name still hung on the sign outside, though now he wore it like a stranger. He studied the small details, each one louder than words. The chipped counter, the worn menus, the hollow expressions of staff repeating motions as though life had been drained from them. It should have been his legacy, a place where fairness gave people dignity. Instead, he sat at his own creation, watching it twist into something unrecognizable. The paradox gnawed at him. Once he had waited tables saved, every coin promised himself no worker would ever be invisible again. Now, from the corner booth, he saw invisibility had become policy. The system he built for equity had been bent into a mechanism for theft. The bitterness was not in the coffee cooling before him. It was in the realization that the dream he had nurtured had been hollowed from within. He sat silent, a stranger to his own house architect of a structure now poisoned. And no one around him knew that the man in the corner was the very soul of the company, forced to watch its corruption in plain daylight. Maribel Rowan emerged from behind the counter, her presence quiet yet undeniable. Hair tied back in a simple knot, sleeves frayed at the seams, apron clean but faded from too many washings. Her body was slight, but each step she took carried steadiness, a rhythm born of discipline rather than hope. She placed a steaming cup of coffee before him. The movement was so precise the porcelain did not tremble against the table. A single word accompanied the gesture, polite, restrained, professional. She did not linger, did not expect thanks. Yet, in her eyes there was a weight no uniform could conceal, a sadness that had learned to remain unseen. Harlan watched, careful not to betray recognition. There was something different in her. She worked not as one surviving, but as one still clinging to a fragile sense of purpose. In a place drained of pride, she carried intention. The difference was subtle, but it struck him deeply. Around her, exhaustion moved like fog, suffocating every gesture. But she cut through it, moving with a quiet determination that spoke louder than any smile plastered on a manager's face. She was the type of worker his system was supposed to protect, the kind that gave meaning to the word sunrise. And yet she moved unseen, swallowed by a culture that rewarded those who stood nearest to power rather than those who carried the weight of the work. She was a light dimmed on purpose, and he could not look away. From his corner, Harlan let his gaze travel across the room. The scene was mechanical. Plates carried without urgency, mugs refilled without warmth, hands wiping tables as if pulled by strings. The motions were correct but lifeless. It was the performance of labor stripped of spirit. The silence was telling. No laughter, no chatter, only the dull repetition of tasks done because they must be, not because they mattered. It was survival dressed as service. He remembered how a diner should feel, the hum of energy, the pride in small gestures, the sense that even modest work could hold dignity. Here, none of that lived. The air was heavy, thick with resignation. Employees moved like ghosts, tethered to routines they no longer believed in. And through this fog, Maribel's presence stood out all the more. Her steps had intention, her gestures precision. She was not faster or louder than the rest, but she still carried the act of caring where others had surrendered it. The contrast pierced him. Harlan understood then the failure wasn't in profits or performance reports. On paper, this branch thrived. In truth, it was hollow. The soul of the place had been stolen, replaced with a culture of quiet endurance. He leaned back, the weight of recognition pressing into him. What he saw was not merely mismanagement. It was decay from within. The structure still stood, but the spirit that once animated it had been methodically stripped away. Clinton Rourke entered with the polish of a man rehearsed in every movement. His shirt carried the stiffness of careful pressing, his hair fixed without flaw. To the regulars he extended a hand grip, firm smile, flawless words, smooth as if he had memorized every line. From a distance he was the image of a successful manager, confident and composed. Yet when he turned, the charm fell from his face. The warmth evaporated, leaving a gaze that was cold, distant, calculating. His eyes bypassed the staff entirely, as though they were furniture, as though their presence required no acknowledgement. He focused instead on the glowing screen of the POS terminal, the numbers dancing across it holding more of his attention than any living soul in the room. Walt watched, and behind the disguise he carried, anger stirred. Clinton embodied the wrought, perfectly outward polish, inward neglect. A mask worn too easily, too convincingly, for too long. The contrast between the handshake and the indifference was not subtle. It was jarring, sharp, impossible to mistake. This was not oversight, it was design. Behind Clinton came Darren Voss, younger, sharper, and steeped in arrogance that needed no words. His posture was loose but proud, chin tilted as though the floor itself belonged to him. The staff shifted at his approach, shoulders stiffening, eyes sliding away. None wished to meet his gaze. He moved straight to the POS terminal and planted himself there like a sentinel. He never touched trays, never carried plates, never busied his hands with the weight of real service. His fingers belonged only to the machine, tapping codes, confirming entries, waiting as if the money would obediently appear for him alone. Every gesture carried ownership not of the job, but of the privilege to take without question. He leaned against the counter body, relaxed as if the labor of others existed only to feed his quiet dominion. Walt marked the scene carefully. This was no clumsy theft, no hidden trick. It was entitlement displayed in daylight. Darren's presence screamed what the entire system whispered: the true work was done by others, but the rewards were carefully directed into chosen hands. Among the staff moved Leighton Cross, thin, withdrawn, a shadow rather than a figure. His eyes carried weight, but they never stayed fixed for long. When Clinton glanced his way, Leighton's head dipped, instantly neck-bending, as if reflex had trained him to obey silence. Yet when Maribel passed near, balancing her tray with quiet precision, a flicker ran across his face. His mouth parted as if words pressed against his teeth. For a moment he seemed ready to speak, to acknowledge the injustice hanging thick in the air. But then the spark died. He lowered his gaze and returned to the safety of silence. Walt caught it, the hesitation, the swallowed truth. It was not ignorance, but fear. Leighton knew. The knowledge weighed on him, but he carried it like a burden too dangerous to release. That glimpse unsettled Walt more than arrogance or theft. Open corruption had its own clarity. Fearful complicity was harder, heavier. It meant the culture had not only stolen money, but stolen courage. In Leighton's silence, Walt saw the true reach of the rot. It did not just enrich a few, it suffocated the will of many. Maribel sat at a side table during a lull, her movements small, almost secretive. She drew from her apron a notebook, its cover, frayed corners, bent from years of use. She opened it with care, as though each page carried more than ink, each a witness. Inside, rows of numbers stretched across lined paper, dates, tables, amounts written with meticulous precision. Some were circled in red discrepancies impossible to ignore. The pattern was not subtle, it was glaring. Money had vanished in ways no honest process could explain. Her pen moved again, quick strokes adding another entry in silence. The page absorbed her evidence, another mark in a growing archive of injustice. She did not look around, but her posture betrayed caution, as if the act of writing itself was a dangerous defiance. From his booth, Walt observed. His eyes caught the red circles, the careful margins, the quiet urgency of her documentation. Yet he did not stare. He shifted his gaze to the window, feigning disinterest, every muscle in his body playing the role of indifference. But within, he recognized the truth. She had been building a record. No one asked for proof. She might never be allowed to speak. The notebook was more than paper. It was testimony in waiting, fragile yet undeniable. Walt knew then the rot was not rumor, it was quantifiable, etched in ink, impossible to erase. Later, when the moment allowed, Maribel spoke with the calm of someone long resigned. Her words came evenly, as if they were numbers themselves. "I've lost more than $600 this month." She did not tremble. She did not plead. She simply stated it the way one reports weather. Then came the sharper cut. No one ever asks why. No one cares who divides it or how. The lack of outrage in her tone was worse than anger. It was the voice of someone who had stopped expecting fairness, who had learned that silence was safer than questions. That resignation pressed harder on Walt's chest than the figure itself. He said nothing, but the weight inside him grew. His ribs felt tight, his jaw rigid. $600 mattered, but what mattered more was the way she carried the loss, quiet, isolated, erased. In that moment, Walt saw the deeper theft. It was not just money removed from her pocket. It was dignity extracted from her spirit. The silence of others had sealed it, normalizing what should have been intolerable. For him, the number became secondary. The real revelation was how corruption had taught its victims not to fight, and that was the rot that spread faster than any ledger could record. Walt sat back and his mind dragged him to the past. He had written once into the company charter that tips must remain transparent, that every worker should see in clear numbers what they had earned. He remembered standing before new managers telling them fairness was not a slogan, but a repeated act. Now he watched that same principle bent out of shape until the word fairness meant nothing. The structure existed. The rules remained on paper, but their spirit had been hollowed. What he built had been inverted, repurposed as camouflage for theft. He reached into his pocket and opened his own small notebook, a twin in purpose to Maribel's. He wrote quickly dates, names, fragments of observation. Each note was a seed evidence that would not be ignored. When he looked up, his eyes no longer belonged to a stranger watching. They had sharpened. They were the eyes of a man who once built a company and now prepared to confront its betrayal. The role of guest had ended. The role of investigator had begun. And in the quiet booth, Walt knew this was no longer a question of missing dollars. It was a question of whether the company he had created could still be reclaimed, or whether it had already been lost to the corruption that now fed in silence. The fight had declared itself. He would not sit back again. Between refills and silent gestures, Walt leaned closer, voice low but steady. "Why don't you run the payments yourself?" Maribel's answer came without hesitation, yet it carried a kind of quiet defeat. "I don't have access to the POS." She did not look at him when she added, "Clinton decides who gets the rolls. Only those he assigns can process payments. Only they receive digital tips." The words slipped into the air with the weight of inevitability, not outrage. For her, this was simply the structure of life inside the diner. For Walt, it was confirmation. He nodded faintly, his face calm, but within him something sharpened. A flash of cold moved behind his eyes, quick as steel, catching light. Clinton had not merely neglected his people, he had engineered their invisibility. The revelation sat heavy. This was not rumor, not accident, but control. A deliberate tightening of who could be seen and who would remain erased. Walt's disguise held, but his patience thinned. The picture forming was darker than he had imagined, and every detail drove the point deeper. The system was broken by design. Maribel gestured discreetly toward the screen at the counter. Walt followed her eyes. The display flickered with numbers from her last table tip, included modest, but real. Then, within seconds, it vanished. The amount no longer belonged to her. Darren stood before the terminal, arms folded, posture loose but confident. He made no move to hide his dominion over the machine. The glow of the POS reflected on his face as if it were his private vault. Walt studied him carefully. Darren did not need to touch the trays, did not need to sweat under the weight of plates or mugs. His work began and ended with that terminal. The staff passed by him like travelers before a gatekeeper, every transaction filtered through his control. Inside, Walt marked another entry in the case he was building. A moment before, the injustice had been a whisper. Now it was an image burned into memory. The tip disappeared in plain sight, as predictable as sunrise. This was not chance. This was the rule. A regular finished his meal and reached into his wallet, drawing out a folded bill. He pressed it into Maribel's hand with a kind smile. She accepted, thanked him softly, and placed it in the communal tip jar, the way custom dictated. But before her hand even left the counter, Darren moved. With casual ease, he flipped open the jar, scooped out the note, and slid it into his pocket. The gesture was so practiced it seemed rehearsed, as if this theft had long been part of the daily rhythm. No one spoke. No one flinched. The other employees lowered their heads, busying themselves with trays and mugs. Customers kept their eyes on their plates. The silence did not break. It thickened. From his booth, Walt felt the weight of the moment. The diner had transformed into a stage where injustice played openly, and the audience had agreed to remain mute. It was not secrecy that made the theft unbearable. It was the acceptance. The crime did not need shadows. It thrived in daylight sustained by the silence of those who had stopped believing protest mattered. The silence of the diner carried Walt backward in memory. There had been another voice months earlier, an employee who had left under vague terms. Walt still had the number tucked in the corner of his phone, forgotten until now. He dialed quietly, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. The call was brief. Recognition came on the other end, followed by a weary laugh that lacked humor. "You want to know why I left, because no matter how much I worked, it was never enough." The tips disappeared before they reached me. It felt like feeding a machine that only took, never gave. I was breathing, not living. Every effort went somewhere else. Nothing stayed. The words hit with the weight of confirmation. This wasn't a single branch gone astray, not a slip of negligence. It was a pattern, a culture. Walt closed the call and clenched his notebook in his hand. The leather bent under the pressure of his grip. He had proof from within, and now he had testimony from without. The theft was not new. It was systemic, woven into the daily fabric of Sunrise itself. What he once imagined as isolated decay was beginning to look like something far more deliberate, an infection stretching further than the eye could see. Back inside, Walt's eyes drifted toward Leighton Cross. The man moved like a shadow, carrying himself with the weary restraint of one who had seen too much. For a brief moment, Leighton's gaze caught Walt's. It lingered uncertain, then faltered. He shifted on his feet, mouth opening slightly as if to form words. There was something urgent in the flicker of his eyes, something pressing against the surface. Yet, just as quickly it collapsed. He turned away, spine curving inward, retreating into silence. The cowardice was not loud. It was quiet, subtle, almost invisible, yet it spoke volumes. Fear had built its home inside him. His silence was not born of ignorance, but of calculation. He knew the truth, carried it like a stone in his chest, but lacked the courage to set it down. Walt studied him, and what he saw unsettled him more than Darren's arrogance or Clinton's polished indifference. Open theft had its clarity, complicit silence had its poison. In Leighton's refusal to speak, Walt glimpsed the depth of the culture, not just corruption at the top, but resignation among those who knew better. That, perhaps, was the most dangerous part of all. Later, as the floor quieted, Maribel returned to Walt's table with hesitation in her step. She carried the notebook close, as though it were fragile, as though it contained pieces of herself. Leaning slightly, she whispered, "I can't give this to anyone. They'd fire me if they knew." She opened it halfway, the worn spine groaning under years of use. The pages lay bare, columns of dates, tables, sums, each marked with careful ink. Her hand trembled as she held it out, then recoiled, pulling it back toward her chest. Walt's eyes rested on the book. He did not reach for it. Instead, he let the gravity of its presence settle between them. Slowly, he spoke. "Keep writing. One day, it will matter. Don't stop." She lowered her gaze, shoulders tense, yet in her eyes flickered a fragile spark of relief. Walt placed his hand on the table, not touching hers, but anchoring the moment. It was a vow, spoken without ceremony. To him, the notebook was more than records. It was proof written by the invisible, a testimony carved in silence. To her, it was survival. And now it was also a promise that her truth would not remain unseen forever. Walt asked for another cup of coffee, though he hardly touched the first. His attention was fixed on the counter where Darren stood as if rooted. Each time a customer swiped their card, the screen flashed with a tip, small amounts, ordinary gestures of gratitude. For a moment, the number glowed clear and undeniable. Then within seconds, it vanished. Darren's fingers moved quickly, pressing a sequence that looked routine, almost professional. To anyone glancing, it appeared like efficient service, no different from procedure. But Walt watched closer. The movements were too practiced, too precise, as though each erasure had been performed countless times before. The realization tightened in his chest. This was not accident. It was not some overlooked flaw in the system. It was mastery of manipulation. Darren wasn't simply benefiting from the machine he was controlling, it shaping it to siphon what belonged to others. Walt leaned back, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his cap. The proof had become undeniable. The theft wasn't sloppy. It was a craft dressed in the guise of routine, and Darren, calm and confident, behaved like someone who believed he would never be questioned. At another table, Clinton Rourke sat with a group of regulars. His voice carried warmth, the practiced tones of trust and authority. He laughed at their stories, shook hands, nodded with the ease of a man admired. His posture radiated success as though he embodied the brand itself. But just behind him, Maribel carried an entire row of tables on her own. Plates balanced on thin arms, mugs trembling as she hurried from guest to guest. Sweat traced down her wrist, soaking into the faded fabric of her sleeve. The strain showed plainly, yet no one in management looked her way. The contrast was brutal. Clinton entertained with a polished smile while the worker who kept the floor alive shouldered the weight alone. Walt watched in silence, his mind circling the question, how long could a company endure when it abandoned the very people who made it breathe? Numbers on paper could conceal fatigue, but not forever. A structure built on neglect had cracks invisible to reports but glaring to anyone willing to see. What was praised in public and what was endured in private had diverged so far that they no longer touched. And it was in that gap Walt realized that corruption flourished most easily. The moment came when Maribel slipped the notebook back toward him. Walt opened it one last time, scanning the pages filled with dates, sums, red circles screaming of theft. He drew his phone and captured each page, quiet clicks marking a record no one could erase. Then, with measured care, he closed the book and placed it back into her trembling hands. His voice was low, but each word carried weight. "Don't give this to anyone. Wait for me to return." Her eyes lifted, and for the first time that morning, light flickered there, thin, fragile, but real. It was not full hope, but the recognition that someone had finally seen. Walt rose from the booth, adjusting his cap. His steps were slow, steady, each one pressed with a restrained fury. To any passerby, he looked like a tired traveler leaving behind an unfinished meal. But inside him, a storm was building. The notebook was no longer hers alone. It was evidence, and his role was no longer that of a guest. As he stepped out into the gray morning, the decision crystallized. This was an investigation now, and it would not end until the rot was dragged into the open. By late afternoon, Walt stepped out of the diner. The rain had not stopped. It fell in thin threads, weaving a gray veil over the street. He stood beneath it, the brim of his cap dripping, his face carved into silence. From his pocket he drew his phone and dialed a number he had not called in months. When Irene Hale answered, her voice was steady, professional, familiar. "We have a problem," he said, each word deliberate. "The POS accounts. Audit them, line by line. Every roll, every override. Don't miss a single trace." She did not ask for details. She did not stall. Her answer came with the clarity of steel understood. The call ended, but its echo lingered. The rain pressed harder against his shoulders as he stood there, knowing the first stone had been cast. This was no longer suspicion. It was war launched in silence. The storm outside was small compared to the one now set in motion. The next morning, Walt returned not as a guest, but in uniform. The fabric was coarse, the name tag stitched with letters that did not belong to him. He entered without ceremony, blending into the hum of staff. Darren was quick to assign him tasks unworthy of notice. Wipe the tables, empty the trash. His tone was casual, dismissive, dripping with superiority. To him, Walt was just another expendable body added to the shift. Walt lowered his head and obeyed, moving with the patience of someone invisible. His hands worked without hesitation, cleaning surfaces, carrying waste, blending into the machinery of routine. His face betrayed nothing, a mask of compliance. But his eyes told another story. They were knives, sheathed sharp beneath the quiet exterior. He moved as ordered, but every step was an act of watchfulness, every moment another entry carved into memory. He had built this house. Now he walked its floors as a servant. The paradox was bitter, but it was also power. For no one suspected the truth, the man scrubbing tables was the very architect of the empire, and he was here to dismantle its rot from within. Later that morning, Walt chose his moment. He asked Maribel to bring him a coffee, nothing more. She approached, weary but steady, and placed the cup before him. From his wallet he drew a single bill, $100, crisp, unmistakable. He set it on the table without flourish. Her breath caught. Her eyes flicked from the note to his face, uncertain. "That's too much," her expression seemed to say, though she dared not voice it. He answered only with a nod. "It's yours." She hesitated, then slipped the bill onto her tray fingers, trembling as though it burned to the touch. Gratitude mingled with fear in her gaze, the knowledge of what might follow pressing against her chest. Walt leaned back, silent, watching. To anyone else it was an act of generosity, but to him it was a snare set carefully in plain sight. The bait had been laid. The truth would show itself not in words, but in what the system chose to erase. Minutes passed. Walt kept his eyes fixed on the screen above the counter. The transaction registered $100 in gratuity, bright and undeniable. The figure glowed like proof etched in light. Then, without warning, the number collapsed. The tip dropped to zero, erased as if it had never existed. Darren stood beside the terminal, his posture-relaxed lips curling into the faintest smirk. It was not the smile of carelessness, but of ownership. His hand brushed his shirt pocket where the bill now disappeared, hidden in plain view. The room absorbed the act without protest. Customers continued their meals. Staff shifted trays from table to table. Not a single face lifted in recognition. The theft unfolded openly, and yet the world pretended blindness. Walt's eyes narrowed, but he did not move. The truth was there displayed for all. It needed no explanation. The mask had slipped, and corruption had shown its naked face. Walt sat motionless in his booth, the porcelain cup gripped tighter in his hand. The ceramic creaked faintly under the strain, but he kept his body still, his expression unreadable. Inside, though fire spread fast. Rage pressed against his ribs, demanding release, yet he forced it down. His time had not come. Not yet. Across the room, Maribel stole a glance at him. Her eyes met his for only a heartbeat carrying sadness, apology, and fear in equal measure. She said nothing. She turned back to her work shoulders, heavy steps precise. The silence that hung between them was sharper than accusation. Words would have been easier, but silence carried its own verdict. It told of a culture where injustice was not just tolerated, but expected. Walt swallowed the fury and let the moment pass outwardly. Within, he sharpened his resolve. He would not confront them here, not in a way they could dodge or deny. He would wait until the moment left them no escape. Later, the door opened quietly, and Irene Hale slipped inside. She chose a table in the far corner, unnoticed by most. In her hands lay a tablet, the screen already alive with streams of data. With a subtle connection, the diner's POS system unfolded under her touch. Numbers rolled down logs of transactions stretching into weeks. Patterns emerged instantly, duplicate accounts role assignments that made no operational sense, tips rerouted in ways that defied logic. Then, deeper still, a line of payments flagged red. A company name surfaced, tucked into the flow like camouflage, a shell entity receiving steady transfers each Friday. Its address led nowhere, its records thin, but the amounts matched perfectly with the tips that had vanished. Walt read the glow of her screen from where he sat. The realization cut deep. This was not a single branch gone rogue. It was a network systemic reaching beyond these walls. What he had thought was a theft of pocket change was in truth architecture, a scheme built to bleed silently from within. When his shift ended, Walt stepped out into the evening. The rain had thinned to a drizzle soft against the pavement, but inside him the storm had only grown. He did not glance back at the diner. There was nothing left to observe. Everything he needed was already etched into his mind. He called Irene. The line connected quickly, her silence steady on the other end. "Prepare," he said. "Next week, I return. No disguises, no pretenses." For a moment, there was only the hum of distance. Then her response, sharp and cold, understood. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The decision was complete. What began in whispers would end in clarity, in the kind of confrontation no one could deny. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for exposure had arrived. The drizzle fell around him, but he walked as if through fire. The storm was no longer outside. It lived in him, and it was waiting. 7 days later, the diner buzzed with the noise of morning rush. Plates clattered, conversations overlapped, coffee hissed into cups. The air felt ordinary, untouched by the secrets buried within it. Then the door opened. Harlan West stepped inside wearing a gray suit, shoulders squared, presence undeniable. The disguise of Walt Granger was gone. What remained was the founder, the architect, the man whose name hung above the entrance. The room froze. Servers halted mid-step, trays hovering. Customers glanced up, sensing the weight of something unspoken. Clinton Rourke forced a smile, smooth but brittle, the kind worn thin under pressure. Darren stood near the terminal, confidence faltering in the shadow of the man now standing before him. Harlan did not need to announce himself. His very arrival tore the veil away. The confrontation had begun, and there would be no returning to silence. Harlan crossed the floor with deliberate steps. He reached the counter, rested his hand on the cold wood, and let the room hold its breath. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but it carried through the diner like a weight dropping. I did not build Sunrise to turn it into a family bank. The words sank into every ear. The chatter died. Even the clink of silverware seemed to retreat. Clinton's smile strained his jaw, tightening beneath it. Darren's hands hovered uncertainly over the same screen he had once commanded with ease. His fingers trembled, betraying him. The staff stood motionless, caught between fear and anticipation. Some avoided his gaze. Others, for the first time, lifted their heads. Harlan's presence filled the space not with anger shouted, but with truth laid bare. The accusation did not need embellishment. It was simple, undeniable, and heavy enough to bend the air around it. The reckoning had begun. Irene Hale stepped forward, tablet in hand. The glow of its screen cut through the silence. With a few taps, numbers unfolded, transactions, tips, balances, all laid bare. The data spoke without embellishment. Tips entered, tips rerouted, tips erased. Line after line betrayed the same truth money that should have reached the servers had been siphoned elsewhere. Then the shell appeared, its name, bland, faceless, designed to hide. But Irene's finger hovered over one detail, and the screen displayed it in sharp clarity, an email address long abandoned but still traceable. Clinton's. The connection was no longer rumor. It was visible, undeniable, and damning. The room shifted. Jokes died on lips, smiles fell away. Employees stared at the screen as if watching their own exhaustion quantified in numbers. Customers leaned forward, whispers curling around the room like smoke. There was no laughter now, no charm left to mask the rot. The truth was written in light, and no one dared to look away. Clinton tried his voice, straining under the weight of the evidence. "This is a technical glitch," he insisted, his words brittle, already cracking. Before the excuse could settle, Irene tapped again. Another feed opened, grainy but clear, the diner's own security camera. The footage played silently, frame by frame. Darren standing by the counter, sliding the $100 bill into his pocket. No hesitation, no confusion, just theft caught in motion. The sound of disbelief rippled through the room. Customers whispered, staff shifted uneasily, the air alive with murmurs. Darren stood, rigid color draining from his face, his bravado stripped bare. Clinton's protest collapsed into silence, his lips parting, but no words emerging. The mask had shattered. The system that pretended at fairness was caught on its own watch, the proof undeniable to every witness in the room. For the first time, Darren and Clinton stood exposed not by rumor, not by suspicion, but by evidence that could not be erased. The walls they had built around themselves crumbled, and the room, once silent from fear, now filled with the sharp breath of recognition. Harlan's gaze fixed on Clinton, unblinking. His words fell like iron. "You are suspended. Your records will be handed to legal." Clinton's shoulders sagged. His eyes lowered to the floor, stripped of the charm he had worn like armor. There was no reply left in him. Harlan turned to Darren. The young man's posture, once arrogant, now trembled. "If you learn how to work," Harlan said evenly, "the door remains open. But if you steal, it will never be." Darren's fingers shook as he unclipped his access card, placing it on the counter. The small rectangle of plastic felt heavier than stone. His hand lingered, then retreated, empty, defeated. The diner held stillness, not the quiet of fear this time, but the weight of judgment. Employees stood straighter, watching. Customers sat frozen witnesses to a reckoning long overdue. It was not applause that followed, nor cheers. It was silence, deeper, heavier, filled with the recognition that the scales had shifted. For once the guilty had been named aloud, and the truth spoken in front of all. Leighton stood frozen, his thin frame trembling. For weeks his silence had weighed on him like a chain. Now, watching Clinton stripped of power and Darren cornered by truth, something shifted. His lips parted, a shallow breath escaping as if a stone had been lifted from his chest. Relief, raw and unexpected, flickered across his face. Around him the staff seemed to awaken. Eyes once fixed to the ground began to rise. Shoulders long, bowed under fear, straightened. The silence that filled the diner was no longer suffocating, it was clearing like air after a storm. Maribel clutched her tray against her chest, her knuckles white, but her gaze burned with something new. Not defiance, not triumph, but recognition that their suffering had finally been seen. For the first time, the weight of dread no longer ruled the room. It was being replaced by something rarer release, the kind that comes not from cheering but from knowing the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Harlan's eyes swept across the diner, steady and unflinching. From now on, he said each word slow, deliberate. Those who do the work will be the ones recorded. No more invisible roles. No more tricks hidden in the system. He turned to the terminal, tapping the counter with his hand. Every person will log in under their own name. No substitutes. No shadows. A young employee barely past his first month hesitated at the screen. His hands shook as he entered his ID, uncertain if the system would even accept him. Then the display lit up. His name appeared in clean letters, undeniable. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not fear. It was recognition. Every eye turned to the screen where a worker long ignored now stood visible in digital light. It was a small act, yet it carried the weight of a new beginning. For the first time, the system reflected the truth. Clinton walked slowly toward the door, his steps heavy, his eyes fixed on the ground. He did not speak, did not argue. The charm that once wrapped around him had dissolved into silence. He left not as a leader, but as a shadow of what he pretended to be. Behind him, Darren removed his access card with trembling fingers. He set it on the counter, unable to meet anyone's gaze. His face carried no arrogance, now only the hollow look of someone stripped bare. The staff did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply watched, their expressions marked not by gloating, but by the heavy understanding of what had passed. This was not victory in the shallow sense. It was closure, quiet and sober. In that stillness, one truth lingered. A chapter had closed. The silence of fear had been broken. The rot had been named. And though the room remained subdued, everyone present understood they had witnessed the end of something corrosive and the beginning of something fragile waiting to be built. Harlan reached into his wallet and drew out the same bill that had once disappeared in silence. He placed it on the counter, the green edges flat against the wood, heavy with meaning. His eyes turned to Maribel. "You earned this long ago," he said. Voice steady. "The system is only now returning the truth." For a moment, she did not move. Her breath caught her hand, hovering as though afraid the money might vanish again. When she finally reached for it, her fingers shook. Tears welled at the corners of her eyes, but no words came. None were needed. The silence stretched not empty but full, carrying the weight of every stolen hour, every erased effort. The bill lay between them, but it was no longer paper. It was recognition, dignity restored. And in that moment, the promise of fairness was not abstract, it was tangible, resting in her hands. From that day forward, the screen above the counter changed. Each tip recorded not as numbers floating in anonymity, but as names shining clearly. When Maribel served a table, her name appeared in clean letters beside the amount. She glanced at it once, almost disbelieving, before turning back to her work. Around her, the other staff experienced the same revelation. Those who had been shadows saw their own names lit for the first time. The room carried a new sound, not loud but steady, the quiet relief of certainty. No more glances toward the register, no whispered doubts about missing dollars. The proof was instant, undeniable, shared. There was no longer an invisible class. Each worker was seen, their labor tied to their name, their presence confirmed. It was not grand celebration, but something stronger, the return of trust. The machine no longer erased them. It recorded them. And in that small act, fairness became visible every hour, every shift, every day. Maribel's story did not end within the diner's walls. In the weeks that followed, she was no longer just a server. She became the guardian of the new system, tasked with ensuring transparency across every branch. She traveled from one location to the next, speaking not from manuals or policies, but from memory. She carried no slide decks, no scripted lectures. Instead, she told her own story, how silence once swallowed her, how she kept writing when no one listened, and how the truth finally surfaced. Her voice was quiet, but its weight was undeniable. Workers leaned closer when she spoke, recognizing their own fears in her account, their own hope in her outcome. And in that simple act, sharing her story, she carried more force than any memo stamped with a corporate seal. Maribel had been nearly erased. Now she was the one ensuring no one else would be. Her presence became proof that fairness, once a fragile ideal, could take root and spread. The chain did not just change its software, it changed its story, and she was the one telling it. The first message came from a new hire. The first time I saw my name on the screen, I cried. Another, from someone who had once quit. I don't need more. I only need not to be erased. Small stories traveled like sparks across the branches. a trainee whispering thanks after her first shift, a veteran pausing in disbelief when his tips finally matched the hours he worked. Fairness had begun to spread not in slogans but in lived moments. Places once muted by fear now carried murmurs of gratitude. Harlan read the reports quietly, his eyes resting on the words of people who had no reason to lie. He closed the page with a single nod. The proof was not only in numbers. It was in the voices that finally believed they were seen. The monthly report arrived columns of figures neat and precise. Revenue held steady margins strong, but one detail stood apart. Employee turnover had fallen by 18%. Yet that was not what Harlan underlined. His pen drew a line beneath a single survey question. Do you feel seen at work? It was not a metric for investors nor a point for the boardroom. It did not live in charts or dashboards. It lived in the faces of servers, in the steadier rhythm of their steps, in the quiet pride of work restored. That question, simple and fragile, outweighed every financial line, for in its answer lay the truth of whether the company had a future. Harlan leaned back, pen resting still. He knew then he had not just saved a brand. He had preserved its soul. Morning light spilled across the same diner where it all began. Harlan sat alone, a cup of coffee before him, a slice of toast untouched. The room felt lighter now, no longer weighed down by silence. Maribel passed by, not a server anymore, but a guide, steady in her new role. Harlan slipped a folded note beneath his plate. Thank you for writing when others stayed silent. And to those listening, a question remains. Have you ever witnessed injustice at work? Would you rise and speak, or stay silent, carrying the memory forever?